Hey College Success, this is your lecture video for Chapter 8 on communicating. I think this chapter is really integral because communicating really transcends the college atmosphere. We communicate every single day, verbally, non-verbally, through writing. It just doesn't matter. We're constantly communicating. Even if we're not aware of it, our body is sending like nonverbal cues. So this is a really important chapter. And so for that reason, I really do recommend that even after I go through my slideshow, that you get into, as I always recommend this, get into the chapter and really take some time to go through it so that you can make sure that you understand and get some tips, because I think this is another area in which we could always brush up on our communication skills, especially as we find ourselves in different contexts and the way that technology is evolving. So all of these tips in this chapter can help us navigate those situations. So the purpose of the chapter, you can kind of see the outline here, just talk about why we communicate, the use of technology in communication, how communication can vary by context, and as barriers to communication. So how do you communicate? So here are these self-analysis questions right at the beginning of every chapter. Just kind of take a moment to think about these. Do you think your mobile device is effective and appropriate for most communication? For instance, do you think it's appropriate for you to send your boss a text message calling off work or an email versus a phone call? Do you use your texting and emailing and social media for certain circumstances, and for others you would never think of doing that? Like, it just kind of depends, I guess, on the situation, right? So how do you use that? Do you have a good sense of how to communicate in different environments and situations? Do you listen more than you talk? And do you have lots of experience with research projects and essays? So there's a lot of quotes in this chapter that I really like. The first one here: the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. This quote kind of reminds me of that game, if you've ever played the game Telephone, where someone whispers into someone's ear a phrase or a statement or something, and then it goes down the line, and by the time it gets to the last person in line, it's just completely morphed. It's just kind of like this illusion that communication is going on. Or if you've ever been in a room full of people and there's someone speaking and they say something to 10 people, and then for whatever reason 6 or 7 of those people walk away with a completely different understanding that the other people did. So like, sometimes we think we're being clear in our communication and we find out really we haven't been, or maybe the speaker hasn't been very clear. So communicating is such an integral part of our day-to-day life. So again, the purposes of this chapter to talk about like the variables in communication, the purpose, the role technology plays, the different contexts and barriers. So just a real quick overview. Do you think about the ways that you communicate? Do you think about the variables in different situations? How do you communicate? I know, in current society, a lot of people tend to prefer to send a text message over a phone call. And I fall into that category. My life is a little chaotic. I have 3 children. I'm always on the go. And so I may not always have time for a full conversation because there's just so much going on around me that it's easier for me to send a quick text message or even just an email. There are still some people, though, who like to hear someone's voice, because it's hard to communicate through text message or email because tone is not always greatly, conveyed and might be misconstrued. So just how do you communicate? Do you kind of change it up based on the situation? And so when our textbook talks about communication, these are the definitions that they use: a process by which information is exchanged using symbols, signs, behavior, and kind of maybe at the same time, communication is giving, receiving, or exchanging ideas, messages, signals through different media, enabling individuals or groups in order to persuade, get information, or share information or emotions. So I always like this slide right here. This mom not understanding like the different acronyms of things. Technology really has created new rules for communication because there is a different expectation and structure maybe to communication. And so when we are communicating through text messages, through email, through social media, we still have to keep all of this in mind. Who are we talking to? Why are we talking to them? And what is the goal? Now, all of that should be kept in mind no matter what. Like, anytime we're communicating, who are we talking to? So we're very clear. Why are we talking to this person and what is our goal? But sometimes when we're online, we also have to think of these things because it can kind of get lost in an online setting because we're behind a keyboard. And so it's easy to forget that we are communicating with real people whenever we are emailing or, interacting on social media. Which leads to the fact that communication is a two-way street. We need to be better. I say that because I think society overall fails sometimes to be active in their listening. too often people are just waiting for their turn to talk versus actually listening to what someone is saying. So, being a good listener, you do need to focus, and it does take some practice. You want to try to like block out distractions. You want to avoid trying to hop in every chance you get to give your own examples or your own experience. You want to be able to just kind of literally internalize what someone else is saying to be able to give them active feedback. This leads into, why do we communicate? When we speak to someone, when we write, whether it's a paper, whether it's a post, does this have a purpose? What kind of result do I expect from this communication? And then, do I change how I communicate depending on the response that I want or need? If you are trying to ask a company for a donation, you might change how you communicate because you have a specific need, versus if you were just writing to a friend about, a donation drive that you're doing. You should be changing how you communicate based on different needs and wants. This is another quote that I like. We tend to use Mark Twain in this class a lot. The difference between the right word and almost the right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. That really just goes to show that sometimes just the smallest either insertion or absence of a word can make a huge difference in understanding the meaning. So this, I think we actually like a repeat, thinking about like, what do we bring to communication with others? This goes back into the technology piece. Do you think technology is really important to your ability to communicate well? I almost feel like for the most part, we rely on technology quite a bit to communicate effectively. Other than when we are sitting face to face with someone, we are communicating heavily with technology. So just kind of think about that. Reflect, is technology vital to your ability to communicate? Do you follow certain rules? And we're going to talk about them when you communicate online. And then, how do you control your online communication? So these rules of online is netiquette. And this shouldn't hopefully not be the first time you've heard of netiquette. This is in your, any online class in Blackboard. There's like kind of a built-in like netiquette guidelines. So some basic netiquette, you don't want to write in all caps or type in all caps. That means that you're screaming. Like, that's how that's interpreted. You want to make sure that you are apologizing if, like how they put this, here, if someone does not hear what you're saying the way you meant it, because we obviously can't hear when we're typing, but when we receive those messages, make sure that you're very aware of the tone that you're trying to convey, because we know that, we can't see or hear tone rather whenever we are typing, or facial expressions. So you have to be really mindful of the types of words that you use. And that's why it says, maybe put in that it's your opinion and be respectful of your audience. All of those things are things to keep in mind whenever you are communicating in an online fashion. And you will see this as part of one of your assignments for this chapter. Reingold comes up with these take control of your communication, like these 5 different ways and things that we should think about whenever we are mostly talking online. Some of these will kind of crisscross with real life talking, if you will, communication. We want to think about our attention, how our focus are we around people or information around us, our participation, how are we responding or generating content or giving information when we're online. Are we working with other people? Collaboration. Are there times where we avoid working with other people? Do we cooperate with people in any way with technology? Our network awareness. So are you, this kind of goes right here, talks about like influencers. Are you in certain communities, or you belong to certain groups? Do you follow certain influencers or leaders online? And how does that, do you take information away from that? What emotions are you giving and taking? And then critical consumption. Are you being mindful of what you're reading online and what you're putting out there as well? How reliable and factual are the things that you are reading as well as that you are sharing? What are the motivations behind those things? So you'll see this pop up in your chapter 8 quiz. So just keep these in mind. Network awareness piece again goes into, influencers. Do they have an impact on you? How does that impact your communication, or do you pass information along from these influencers? We also talk about in the chapter about how we should be evolving with technology, because technology is constantly evolving. Our communication with technology should also evolve. evolve. Some things we need to make sure we're aware of. It was kind of mentioned briefly in a couple slides ago. Because we communicate often online, there are fewer nonverbal cues. Someone can't see, I'm sitting here doing hand gestures right now, actually. We can't see the hand gestures. We can't see the facial expressions. We can't hear the tone of voice. So those are things we always want to be aware of whenever we are communicating using a technology. And these are just different websites and ways to get connected, going back to some of the concepts I just mentioned. All right, the context of communication. Does your communication change in certain situations? Meaning, are you going to communicate through email in one situation or a phone call in another situation? Do you use an altered style of talking when you're with different people? That's called code switching. And I imagine all of us do this. It's pretty natural. You speak one way at home with, your spouse, your children, your parents, whoever it is that you might live with or are close to, versus you're probably not going to speak that way in your work environment. And then you're probably going to speak another way again in the college environment. Like, we kind of just switch a little bit of an altered style of talking. And then what role does listening play in your communication? So we want to make sure that we are aware of, the context around a certain message and the circumstances and who we're with and what's going on, because that does make an impact on our communication. And this is what I mentioned just a moment ago, the code switching. We want to make sure that we are being aware of how we communicate. Just like in a work environment, there's probably a dress code, whatever that might look like for your particular field, just like there's like a way that we speak in our fields, a way that we speak at home, a way that we speak in our places of worship, whatever it might be. So sometimes we just have to be aware that we are doing a little bit of that communication change, thinking about what we want to say and how we're saying it and who are we communicating with. Part of communication is also just being aware of emotional intelligence. This goes a couple ways, like knowing your own emotions, knowing kind of things that might set you off to be either like really passionate or really upset or angered or excited, as well as being able to read that on other people. If you are looking at someone and you can tell that they're getting frustrated or disappointed or angry, you might alter or, change the way you're communicating, because if you cannot either recognize your own emotions or in someone else, there might be some miscommunication going on there as well. So we want to make sure that we are also, along with that emotional intelligence, we are listening. It is very active. We are trying to focus on the speaker. Again, not just wait for our turn to talk, but really making sure that we're paying attention to what the speaker is talking about. This is another quote I like. Words are the source of misunderstandings, right? Makes sense. Sometimes we say things and they're interpreted in different ways, or we don't understand the words that someone else are using. And that can come into, and this was actually something brought up in a previous chapter, like our preconceptions, our biases or assumptions. Sometimes when we're speaking to someone, or maybe it's not even the person, it's the topic, we have preconceived ideas or assumptions. And so we may either close ourselves off to talking about that, or maybe the message that we are trying to convey turns other people away or draws them in. Both things can happen. So we just need to be aware of our own biases, our own assumptions, and how that could play a role in conversations. And then something else that the chapter then closes on is some things that lead to communication barriers. So there are plenty of things along with, preconceptions and biases that could get in the way of being understood or understanding. And these are just a few of tons of things, how you or someone else might identify, your age, your cultural background, your ethnic background, your religion, your family, your education, your anything like that. Sometimes when yours might differ so drastically from someone else, there might be a communication barrier. A literal language barrier might exist as well, but all of these things come into play because you may not understand where someone else is coming from, and that can lead to a communication barrier. All right, so that is the kind of the meat of the chapter. As I say with every chapter, I really do encourage you to go back into the chapter and really click around, because especially communication is such a key piece of almost everything we do, right? We are constantly communicating, even if we don't mean to. Our body language communicates, our facial expressions communicate, whether we want them to or not. So knowing how to be better with our communication, whether it's spoken, written, nonverbal, it doesn't matter. This is a really important chapter to look at. Again, you will see, if I scroll down a little bit here, this for sure in your chapter 8 quiz. So please make sure you just look at this a little bit more. It's going to talk to you in detail on each of these areas. So when the question comes up relating to Reingold's, the 5 areas here of communication online, just go ahead and read through those a little bit more in depth. Make sure that you're comfortable with each of those areas and you can adequately address that question. All right, so let me know if you have any questions on this chapter. Bye.